I'm Shobana Shankar. I'm a professor of history and Africana studies at Stonybrook University in the State University System of New York.
Yes, thank you for joining us. We're going to be talking about your book, An Uneasy Embrace, Africa, India, and the Specter of Race. So could you explain to us, kind of my first general question is, how did you come to write this book, and what was something that you found interesting or learned in the process?
So I started thinking about this topic and specifically if race is even a term or concept with any value in the relationships between Africans and Asians, South Asians in this case. When I was working on my first book, which was about religion and Muslim Christian encounters. And in that context, I came across in northern Nigeria Muslim Indian missionaries who were trying to convert Nigerians, among whom there are many, many Muslims. And I had been researching American missionaries in largely white American missionaries in Nigeria. So the question came to me, did these, how did these Indian missionaries see Africans, because they were both colonized people, and how, and did Africans, Nigerians, see these Muslim Indian missionaries in the same way that they saw white Western missionaries from the United States or from Europe? So I was thinking about that question from being in Nigeria, but then also while in Nigeria, learning about longer history of Indians being in Nigeria. And Nigeria, because it's in West Africa, is not seen as a country in Africa that has a large Indian population because of its relative distance from India. But there is an Indian population, and they were telling me stories about living in Nigeria over a very long time. I mean, they're essentially Nigerian now, or that's how they feel. And then I began to think about, well, how do Nigerians see them? And so in my book, An Uneasy Embrace, what I wanted to do was look at the history of India and Indians in Africa through African lenses, not through the Indian perspective of being in African countries or societies, and not necessarily through the European perspective, which it was really through colonialism and colonial networks, particularly in West Africa, through which Indians came to settle in African countries and that colonies at that time, and that was largely through for economic reasons or for work reasons in colonial infrastructure, projects. So that was really the motivation. And also, I mean, one of the chief findings that I that I talk about in the book is that it's a very long, deep, complicated relationship with a lot of different manifestations in different parts of the continent that's very difficult to generalize. And so, one major takeaway for the book that I wanted to get across is this is a complex set of relationships that can't be captured by the term solidarity necessarily, can't be captured by the term animosity or opposition, but that it's dynamic and changing, and a historical lens is an important one to take.
Yeah, and I think you fleshed that out really well in the book. It's well done in that you do seem to sidestep some of the booby traps that are set for us through usual historical lenses. So before we get into some of the characters in your book and some of the arguments you make, can you give us a brief overview of you kind of touched on it in your first answer, but how Indians and Africans touched each other and interacted before colonialism, and then how the colonial project expanded it, and then in the fall of colonialism, what that changed in that relationship. So, I mean, I know in the book you begin with slave and soldiers on the African side and the Muslim Indian traders and proselytizers. So, if you could kind of walk us through that dialogue or interaction, that would be fantastic.
Okay, so I think that in different parts of the continent there are different touch points. The physical interactions between Africans and Indians have, began centuries earlier in Eastern Africa and is quite old in Eastern Africa, so that you have, you know, traders, relationships forming, religious networks, particularly in Islam, um, that Africans and Indians that those cultural relationships, and economic relationships. And there was the enslavement of Africans who were, particularly from Eastern Africa, though I think now we have more research that some of the enslaved Africans came from even deeper in the continent to Arabia and India, maybe, or the Sudanic region. So, so that there was a lot of different kinds of relationships that, again, it's sort of hard to generalize to say that it was only trade that brought them together. It was only religion, but it was such a complex relationship that there were a lot of dimensions to it. And um, maybe the connections weren't always direct people to people, but there was uh, a knowledge of goods, particularly that West Africans had about the world to the east. Textiles. There were a lot of Indian textiles in Western Africa that the Europeans used during the transatlantic slave trade, and that became an important item for West Africans themselves. Not because they didn't have textiles, but because it's added to the kind of universe of textiles that already existed. And there were some cross currents, and I think I'm centering the African continent and India, but they were obviously interacting. Africans and Indians were interacting in the Atlantic world, in particular in the Caribbean, in places like Jamaica and Trinidad and Guyana. Um, and those were conditioned by the slave trade and the experience of slavery and indentureship. But in Africa or in the old world, those relationships, slavery was one manifestation of the relationship where enslaved Africans were enslaved in India, but there were also free Africans in India, as we know. And there were also Indians settled in African societies, spaces before the arrival of Europeans. If we take Ethiopia or evidence from East Africa, we see that there was that kind of relationship as well. Um, I think what I do in the first chapter is to say that, some of those older multiform relationships were possible even during the beginning part of the colonial period, say 1900 to the 1920s and 30s. But there were dramatic shifts that occurred with the politics of decolonization and the politics of nationalism, uh, both within India, where how Indians would fit into independent African countries ruled by Africans themselves.
Mhm.
So I think you really start to see in, in the book the moments where the tensions arise. They're not ever present. Um, and they're not only about economic resentment or politics, there's also cultural
Mhm.
factors. And I wanted in the book to say, there may be areas of similarity between African and Asian cultural ideas and systems, but it's not a total um, similarity. And so some of those cultural differences arose as well, whether it was about religion, or uh, social issues like intermarriage. So I think a lot of those like difference that might have been accepted, tolerated, interesting, a catalyst for curiosity became more uh, politicized in the 1940s going forward.
So we kind of lost you there for a minute in part of your answer. So I may be asking you to repeat something that you said that we didn't get yet. But I do want to kind of return to the post-colonial period because I think that's where some of this race making begins to emerge, and that the conversation between Africans and the Indian population, the diaspora in both give and take, both continents. Um, how does the essentialism of kind of like the white colonial system continue or dissipate after the British kind of take off? And is there this, um, I mean, there's definitely a dialogue between the Indian and African people, but how do they differentiate, if they do, the different races, and what does that look like on the ground?
Hmm. Um, so I think one of the important points to say right away about the post-colonial period is because there were different. What I say in the book is there were very different processes of decolonization in different parts of the continent related to race, such that the relationships between Africans and Indians start looking more different around the continent. So in Eastern Africa, tensions increase related to the Indian diaspora, such that Indians are leaving. There is the question of will they become citizens in countries like Uganda, Tanzania, Kenya. Uh, Nehru in India is saying you should integrate into the societies where you are. Many are leaving. They're going to parts of the world. Some are coming to West Africa. Um, and so because there's clearly a economic advantage and power that Indians have held in East African societies. Now, in Western Africa, there were protests against foreign businesses during the 1940s and into the 50s, but there was a different way that West African leaders and cultural observers and Indians themselves responded to that moment, which is to say, there are ways, that Indian business people can be, or Indian people living in West Africa can be folded into African societies as they're being built in Nigeria, Ghana. I talk about Senegal, where education is a large part of that. Faculty members from, people who are teachers and faculty from South Asia, Pakistan, India, and Bangladesh. I talk less about Bangladesh, come to uh, West African universities and schools. That was something that Nigerians would tell me all the time. I had a teacher from Pakistan or I had a teacher from India, older generations. So, and this is to say, this happened in East Africa too, but the tensions didn't accompany that absorption in the same way. And Senghor's project, I think, was even more intellectually and culturally uh, uh, absorptive, if I can use that word, through negritude of, a francophone originated form of Pan-Africanism, or and Afrocentrism, in which African cultures, which his thoughts have been criticized for essentializing that, were included parts of other parts of the world, so that it's, blackness was not just in Africa, but in South India is the example. I look at Dravidian South India and I get into the politics of the relationship between South India and North India, but other scholars like Kito Swan have worked on Papua New Guinea being in Senghor as the first president of Senegal's kind of purview as part of the Black world. So I look at these different projects of race making that are I want to say positive claims on race and race making and racial identity in this. And I say positive because as I've looked, I'm writing a lot of different little pieces that come off of this. Afrocentrism as an intellectual body or as scholarship has been severely criticized and sidelined in the American Academy, or had been, particularly at white majority universities and in African studies. That was seen in a very specific way, an exclusive way, that Black scholars who, particularly Black scholars, but any scholars who were thought about Afrocentrism and talked about that, were sort of sidelined, in part because it was presumably about intellectual disagreements about, certain parts of history, like Sheikh Anta Diop, the Senegalese scholar, talking about Egypt as a Black civilization. But what I draw attention to is that outside of North America, in India, you found intellectuals, cultural studies, uh, people, authors, writers who were interested in Afrocentrism and who did not reject these ideas. And that's what I was intrigued by, right? That's a direct engagement with race studies and race making that doesn't have to be they're accepting or rejecting it. We don't have to look at it only on the terms of rejecting, or is it legitimate scholarship or is it not, but rather that it spoke to a desire to rewrite intellectual history and cultural studies outside of a European tradition, in a Black tradition.
Yeah, and I think that project is, as you say, I think it's just budding now because I think it seems to be that there's a little bit more acceptance to, as you were saying, kind of the authenticity of these narratives. Whereas if it wasn't somehow tied to the white gaze, colonial or post-colonial, it didn't make sense. And I think someone like Gandhi and Blyden, that contrast speaks a little bit to what you're talking about, right? Because when Gandhi spends a bunch of time in South Africa, he was not the radical he becomes. And Blyden's Pan-Africanism is kind of in contrast to that, but not, I mean, they're not really in dialogue, but they can be put in dialogue, right?
Yeah, no, it's interesting that you picked that up in from the early chapter towards, a later chapter, because I do think that have they are important figures whose work is similar in that um that diaspora changes both of them and shapes their political activism and their intellectual lens in dramatic and important ways. I mean, Gandhi had to have that experience. And I think more, Indian historians have looked at this, people who focus on India, that, he had to have that experience in the highly racialized context of South Africa from in the late 19th and early 20th centuries, building apartheid at that period. I mean, it wasn't called that, but we now, we know that it was being built, white supremacist rule. Uh, and Blyden's experience of going to Liberia from the Caribbean was formative and it was transformative. Um, But they are very different. I talk about how they emphasize very different aspects of the way you even do activism, or what, how cultural identity, or and I say cultural identity can be expressed and galvanized for political protest. Um, Gandhi used later, not in South Africa, but a lot of Hindu um, practices and identification, but and religion more broadly, not just Hinduism, but you know, I think he drew on Christian principles. I think he drew on Islam and Buddhism to some degree. Um, but what always has troubled me is that while Blyden as the father of Pan-Africanism, there is this, you know, implicit connection to race and race politics. Gandhi's, race is absented from Gandhi's history. Because in Indian historiography, race is a very, and I talk about this, a kind of vexed term. I think that's something that's also changing, right? I think now, and this was part of the point in writing the book, is I think we have to question when and where race is important and relevant, but we shouldn't say that it's absolutely not present in this history or that history, because the fact of the matter is it's a practice of power that's been a part of the making of the modern world, and it's very subtle and shifting. So when, and the scholar, other scholars have talked about how, whichever field it is, people say, oh, race, that's an American thing.
Well, and it's interesting because there's this resonance, I guess, or this leftover vibration of the colonial project as envisioned by the British, the Portuguese, the French, which we don't think of them as, we think of America, as you say, as the cradle of racism, right? But these these colonial powers were generating laws and practices and hierarchies that were all founded in race and darkness of skin and essentialism of, you know, the heathen and all this kind of stuff. So it's a complicated um, conversation, I guess, and to realize what those vibrations continue to do is difficult. And I think that's why I'd like you to talk more about Senghor and who he was and how he kind of how he heard those vibrations and what he tried to do with that. And I mean, I liked how you bring in Diop, I think is how you say his name, and again their dialogue of how they kind of approach this aftermath of the race making experience.
Hmm. I mean, I think Senghor being a polymath, and Diop was also a polymath, people who were involved with a lot of different disciplines and seeing connections between Diop for archaeology and linguistics and science, uh I think the time period is very significant to raise. I mean, thinking about Senghor in France, uh in during, at the outbreak of World War II, there's a lot of use of science, and I put science in quotes, to support the project of Nazism and support the project of colonialism, of European colonialism. And so what's really striking in looking at how Senghor became, studied ancient population movements and, was thinking about um, was studying with historical, with linguists and thinking about how population groups relate to each other, right? Because that is the essence of thinking about human difference and sameness. Those were really, I talk about this in the book a bit about how those, excavations, archaeological excavations happening around the world at this moment, and was connecting to linguistic studies. Okay, how are European languages related to languages spoken in other parts of the world? Does that mean they're European also, or are we not special as Europeans? All of those questions were really being debated in this period. And he was very struck by, as I talk about in the book, the Dravidians and who were these supposedly autochthonous people in India when the Aryans invaded. And of course, mentioning the word Aryan, then we know where this is going, right? But I try to put those terminologies. Well, first of all, taking Aryan out of the European context and putting it into the Indian and African context, because in Indian historiography or Indian studies, of course, they deal with Aryans, scholars of India deal with Aryans in the way they do because it's important, it's formative for Indian history, right? I mean, there is clear evidence that a group of people came from, you know, Central Asia who are the Aryans. But for Africans who are not connected to that history in the same way and see Aryanism also through the prism of European colonialism, they are also contending with it. This is what I also wanted to say in the book is these terms we don't operate in isolation to each other. Right. Senghor is a global citizen, colonized as he may be, he's a global citizen and he's an intellectual. And so he's studying these things. So what does Aryanism mean in Africa? And then, well, who are the Dravidians, who the Aryans and Dravidians are contending with each other, in ancient times over this land mass, right? So that those I think are very formative moments for Senghor when then he sees, okay, there is this autochthonous population uh, that if we take a more superficial than presentist view of race, they are darker, their language is different. And then begins this whole questioning and the positing of by different European scholars. And now I've looked back, even Greeks had confused where South India was and thought it was in Ethiopia. They had a better understanding of Ethiopia than they did of India at that point, through their navigations because they were in the Red Sea. But so Senghor takes all of this and rather than making declarative statements about it, uses it as the basis of an intellectual project, an agenda, a questioning, which I think is a very um well, it's very intellectual to question and say, let's talk about what Egypt's position, what where does Egypt fit in this? What civilizations existed in India, in the Indian subcontinent before the Aryans arrived, in East Africa, further west in Africa, because there were definitely connections to between ancient Egypt and it's offshoots. So he's turning it into a question and a proposal that Indira Gandhi and Annamalai University in South India accept. It is the hallmark of how research can be. And that I found very illuminating and also part of this moment of independence that was really exciting. The possibility of rewriting history, the possibility of rewriting academic subjects.
Do you think his inclusion of Lemuria, I think that's how you say it, is discrediting, or is it something that people focus on as a point to kind of discredit his work? Or is it something that um, people have picked up on as what it is in his thinking?
I mean, I think so. Sumati Ramaswamy, who's talked about Lemuria, she talks about this as, this fabulism and this kind of fantastic, kind of way of seeing the world, geography. But what I like about what she does is say, well, there were a lot of people who thought that way. I mean, what is it that makes his version more fantastical than others? And she says, there are all these Tamil people who are deeply invested in this idea. I talk about European scholars who we can now discredit, but I mean, this is the sort of the pinnacle of knowledge and knowledge production, right? So, but they believe in it. So I try to treat all the ideas as kind of equal to each other. It's later, I mean, we all discredit each other all the time. That's what academics do, right? But what's more interesting is, um, to me, is that there is belief. I mean, that's why I've been always interested in religion, is that people believe. And I think even with new studies that want to discredit or just, I mean, one of the things that's interesting with with Senghor's project is people might dismiss it out of hand, but there were no studies to say that's patently false, right? So there's still this belief that kind of exists in it, right? And that's where I think that, you know, possibilities and history, Fred Cooper talks about this in talking about decolonization. There were a lot of possibilities, and it's sort of the necessity of certain economic exigencies and political, I mean, just saying Gore's project doesn't continue with his successor, but I think that's those kinds of um weights come down on these possibilities. But the possibility is something that I wanted to show that he and others, like the Indian scholars who participated in the project, who it was quite remarkable to me. I mean, they all agreed that there was some real, tangible, researchable connections between West Africa, Senegal, as far West Africa as the Atlantic side, to the Indian Ocean, to Lemuria, to, that space. So, so yeah, I mean, I think people would say, oh, there's nothing in this now, right? But then aren't there even less fantastical or less imaginative ideas that also get discredited, right? That's what pushes forward intellectual curiosity and uh, motivation to keep doing.
Yeah, and I mean, when I was reading that section, I kept thinking about Plato and Atlantis, and how, just because he had that fantastical thought, his whole thinking isn't tossed out. He's considered right, one of the best thinkers of the Western canon. So I want to jump ahead to 60s and 70s, late 50s to the 70s, and talk about the cultural dialogue between, you spend a lot of time in the book at Nigeria and India. So if you could kind of talk about how the culture extends this dialogue between the two continents and the different countries in Africa, obviously.
Hmm. I mean, I think here I talk about films to some degree because this is something that other scholars have talked about extensively, particularly people who are, Brian Larkin, who's an anthropologist. There are other scholars who have focused on film because you can really see it in contemporary African Nigerian society, a lot of countries where Indian films are, im- popular, but that popularity ebbs and wanes. But what I'm interested in, why those films, what's in those films, right? And Larkin talks about this and sort of talks about his view of parallel modernities. But what I talk about in the book is, in Senegal and in Nigeria and Ghana, there was this particular moment where it was young people who were really who saw film viewing as Indian film viewing as this escape from their parents. They create these social clubs. As people were telling me, they got married, they had children, they named them after actors and actresses. It was like this kind of being able to perform, but also really invest in this passion. It was like an art community, right? It was a community and dance was really much a part of it. And I talk about the unfinished documentary of Mansour Sohrawardy about this Indophilie in Senegal. Um, so that's one way in which, and I've talked to people in the Indian government who work in African countries who say, yeah, we really try to capitalize on this because this it creates all this goodwill. But I also talk about these other uh, connections, like in religion, the Hinduism example, which there are Hindu follow, religionists in Nigeria, Ghana, particularly, who African Hindus who have this orientation towards Hinduism that's that's inflected through an attachment to indigenous religions. And the reason why I think that's so important is because Christianity and Islam have really, really, if I can say, done a number on indigenous religions on in Africa. And so I think that there are those threads that I explore of how, particularly in the case of the Hindu monastery in Ghana, the Hindu monastery of Africa, but it's in outside of in Accra, how this desire and rediscovery of various indigenous traditions, but also in a very connected to familial ties, the past, history, is shapes this orientation towards Hinduism. And again, this is not to say that there's a one-to-one similarity or parallelism in indigenous religions and Hindu expressions. But there was something freeing in this third space or Hinduism as a third space, right? And I mean, and that the third way is actually kind of when you think about what decolonial, during the era of independence, Nehru or Nkrumah or these other post-colonial leaders or from colonial to post-colonial leaders talked about what is it's a way of being in the world that doesn't have to choose between you know, in the Cold War, cultural, um, cultural restriction. Again, so I think and as I talk about in the example with the Hindu monastery, because now there are a lot of Indians from a lot of different parts of India, of a lot of different strands of Hinduism. In Africa, like in Ghana, for example, and they have seen some something very appealing in the Hindu monastery that's led by an African, or it was he, when he passed away, an African monk. It's freeing in certain ways, which I found really fascinating. This is a complete change from the kinds of decisions that Indians in Africa had to make during the period of the 40s or 50s or 60s, where it was nationalism really constrained how, are you a citizen? Are you not a citizen? There's a new set of um, belonging possibilities made by religion, made by these films at one point that, belonging isn't necessarily political citizenship.
Yeah, when you were talking about the kind of the fandom in Africa for the Indian cultural expressions, I was reminded of like the K-pop fans and the all the people who watch anime and just the this kind of submersion, but also transformation of the because you're seeing it in translation and all this other stuff. So it's a weird interaction. But I'd like you to talk a little bit about the African influence in India, because the Indian diaspora in Africa you focus a lot on, but I think that there's a African, it's not as big, I guess, but could you talk about kind of where India has kind of incorporated some of these threads from Africa?
Yeah, that's a great question. And I think this is a really important topic broadly for future research. Hard to do, and I'll explain some of the reasons why. So there's multiple layerings of the African diaspora. If there's one in India and South Asia generally, as we talked about earlier, there are descendants of medieval era, you know, 14th, 15th, 16th century um, enslaved and free Africans who came, who were in the military, who were in various militaries or were traders, in some cases, religious leaders, like particularly in Islam. So they're their descendants, and there's different names, CDs, Hubshis for these different communities, which who are, in certain like Hyderabad and in Kutch, which is in the west, in certain places, and they come at different points. I mean, there's earlier, even up to the 19th, the 20th century. But in the 20th century, there are also some notable layers of this movement from Africa to, and one I talk briefly about, especially in the Hinduism and Ghana chapter, is West African, so African soldiers in World War II who were stationed in India in Burma, and there's been some really excellent research, interesting research about these West African and East African soldiers, some of whom, I mean, many of whom had kind of wives, Indian wives, because they were there and, developed relationships. Some stayed. Many did come back. But, Oliver Coates is a scholar who's looked at their letters and, that they've written and their pictures of touring the Taj Mahal and other places. So they're one layer, a contingent. Then I talk about students. After 1947, the Indian government makes scholarships available to African students. There was a lot of reticence among African students to take them, particularly in East Africa. But there's been a steady stream of students and some who have stayed. Um, and then there are people who come for, as I talk about with the Hindu monastery, religious reasons. And in what's an untapped area of research, I think, is really looking at Christianity, Christian networks, because in Indian historiography, studies of Christianity in India and Christian communities have been within religious history as opposed to social history, right? Whereas it's different in the study of Africa, where Christianity occupies a different place in Christian missions. But there are a lot of churches now in Africa that are headed by I mean, sorry, in India, who are headed by African, particularly West African, Nigerian or Ghanaian pastors. Mira Venkatachalam has an article about African churches in India, and this is an illustration of how Indian Christians look to African Christian leaders. And I think it's very important to, think about, because Christians are a discriminated minority in India. So having that connection is really important. And I think, again, to bring up the topic of race, I think this is where the Africanness of the pastors is actually a positive, important good. They're not American or European. They are black church leaders who have this spiritual authority.
Yeah. And I want to kind of end on, it's kind of a couple paragraphs in the book, but I found it really interesting in that it kind of speaks to where we are with race and how far we've come and how far we haven't gone yet. And it's the idea of this skin whitening in India and why it's why do you think it's so prevalent in India and the native kind of the indigenous look in Africa is still valued or not as undervalued as in other parts of the world. So like there's a lot of people in the United States who participate in this. You know, they get plastic surgery to have narrower noses and this kind of stuff to be white famous, right, in this country. Um, so maybe you could just talk a little bit about that as kind of wrapping up where we are in race making in the 21st century.
No, I think this is something that you picked up on that is something I wish I could have done more with, and I want to, in future projects, which is that I think this is where gender is really important. Um, I don't think we know all of the reasons why fairer skin and certain features become privileged. I think there are interesting possibilities. Once I was looking at early Portuguese interactions when they went to India and West Africa in the late 1400s, and who the men were marrying locally, and then their children and the privilege that their children got. So then, of course, as children who are, you know, children of white men and Portuguese men and local women, how they look. So were looks the reason that, were their looks the privileged? So, I think we have to go in to look at more of the roots of why fair skin in societies where people generally are not fair skinned is seen as superior. Right? And some scholars have said this is, you know, um, it's very much about class, work, where you work, agricultural versus, more, outside of the sun and these kinds of, it demonstrates a certain kind of education but I think there's a lot more work to be done about this. What was really struck me and what I talked about in those few paragraphs was that, um, you know, whereas in West Africa and other parts of a few other parts of Africa, a few other countries in Africa and other parts of the continent have banned skin lighteners. In India, that's just been, never a sort of a topic, except that during, in the aftermath of, the murder of George Floyd and the founding of the Black Lives Matter movement that really is global, I think Indian women began to protest against Fair and Lovely and this, being sort of marketed to in this way. I think another very interesting, and I think that was through the global influence of Black Lives Matter and looking around the activism of African and African diaspora women. And this is where I think the connection between Africa and the African diaspora in America is really, and the Caribbean is really interesting because there is a global, a transnational activism there that's then become transnational to other countries. Now, I think one thing I did compare is in India, there was that rejection starting, but I know that skin lightening is practiced in other Asian countries as well. I don't know how far the politics have gone in those other countries, like the Philippines or Korea, South Korea. Um, I guess the last point I want to make, though, is this is also not just a women's story. because men also skin lighten in certain countries. And, that is what gender scholars are saying is that this is not, when we're talking about beauty standards, those are gendered. It's not just male and female, but it's this complex interaction of, yeah, just like it's a complex interaction of class, race, gender ideas, it's a complex interaction between different genders. And setting such standards and ages. I mean, parents expecting their children to look a certain way, how we do that to each other. So, I mean, if I were to say, a final point about what this says about race making and where we are, I mean, it's heartening to see the rejection of destructive standards by younger generations in particular, but also I want them to look back to what happened in the 70s. It's really striking that in America might be one country where you can find films where very dark-skinned people appear and are considered beautiful, because that would be very hard to find in Bollywood. So I think, not forgetting history and seeing that some of these battles were fought before in really, important and instructive ways is, sort of the job of us historians to make, more, public. But I also, thanks to you, people will keep reading, I hope.